Good day, this is Dr. Ron McFarland with the University of the Cumberlands. This is ISOL 531 Access Control. Lesson 1, Access Control Framework, Assessing Risk and Impact on Access Control. Now, these slides are present in the course, so you can go ahead and grab from this slide forward in the slide deck. So access control, quite simply, access control enables the authorized person to control access to areas and resources in a given physical facility or computer-based information system. Keep in mind, it's both the physical access and the information system access that we're concerned with access control. When and where is access control needed? People need access control to certain objects within the same or different systems to perform their work. So that gets along with the rights, roles, and responsibilities that people have within a work context or even as a customer context. What do rights, roles, and responsibilities do people have in terms of being a client, a customer, or an employee? Sensitive data. Sensitive data resides in a lot of places, including human resources, your payroll data example. Mergers and acquisitions, those are oftentimes put together, but mergers and acquisitions give quite a lot of intelligence about companies that are being acquired or being merged together. So it's a very sensitive time. A lot of intelligence is shared between companies that are being merged or being acquired, and that kind of intel is really good information for hackers to steal and use. Also, senior level personnel changes or even senior level management in general are good fodder for hackers. We see a lot of the C-suite being targeted by hackers. For example, once a C-suite person gets attacked, they have a higher level of authority in the system, and so therefore it's a gold mine for hackers. Excuse me. Access control, we have a without access control up on the top and with access control. Let me just go ahead and kind of give you an idea about this. With a hacker without access control certainly is intended on misusing or abusing the information system. Information system, I'll go ahead and broadly say it could be things as paper-based items that you have around the office, or even the actual physical information system. So in terms of paper-based, if you have documents, plans that are printed, let's say if you're in manufacturing, those can be modified or even stolen, so there needs to be some sort of physical control. Certainly databases or the information system itself, items can be stolen off of that. So access control provides one level of security, and again, adding levels of security, that's termed defense in depth, which we'll cover a little bit later in the course. Those extra layers, access control being one of the layers, slows down an attacker and perhaps may even prevent the theft of data. Primary components are policies, subjects, and objects. Policies are defined from laws, rules, regulations, if you will. For example, in Europe, there's the GDPR, which is the data protection for individuals. In California, we'll have coming up the consumer protection for individuals, and even things like HIPAA, which is a federal law for health care, FERPA, which is the federal law for protection of student records, and there's a whole ton of legal regulations that are policies that each information system must adhere to. So policies defined from laws, the requirements, and industry guidelines. I want to say as actually industry guidelines include best practices. So if you're looking at DoD, DFARS items for Department of Defense, or ISO type of regulations. They're guidelines and best practices, recommendations that are all part and parcel of policies. Subjects are people who need access to and are restricted from accessing. So you got to know who can get to the information system, whether it's a physical piece of paper all the way through the actual data system, and who doesn't have access. Objects are resources or information that need to be protected. Those are people, places, things, events, those type of objects as well. Access control process. The general process: identification, authentication, and then authorization. Generally, identification, in the next slide we'll kind of gloss over that, but it's who are you? Show me some proof. For example, I identify myself to the ATM, and then I become authenticated. I'm a valid user. Authentication, the system verifies, or it could be a guard at a door, verifies that the credentials are authentic. Think authentication. Is that person authentic? And then finally, what is that person authorized to do? If I gain access to a building, am I authorized to enter every single room in the building? Or based on my authentication, what am I authorized to do within that building? Is it just go to human resources and fill out an application? So that authorization tells the system, whether it's a guard at the door or the information system, what that individual is authorized to do. Here's kind of a slide: identification, authentication, authorization, that depicts that. So I'm going to gloss over this one because we talked about it. Use of the IAA process. This is a little more specific. You see the numbers along the way, one up on top and one down below, and 2 up in the middle, and 3 up on top in the middle as well. Number 1, identification. User presents credentials. That could be something like the account name and password. Could be your ATM card and PIN number, for example. Now, they also mention tokens and biometrics. Tokens are things that you have. Biometrics are things like your handprint, that sort of thing. Authorization. Perhaps up on the top, you see someone is typing in their password, account name and password. That's authorized by the system. The system, the yellow box in the middle. Authentication server, operating system, and I always think of Active Directory. Receives and compares credentials with authorized credentials. Basically does a comparison. If it's matched correctly, access is granted. And now that's just only access. So if the access isn't granted, denial happens, of course. 2.2 up on the slide, that's gaining access to the gray box up on top. That could be some sort of mainframe or even a file server, database server, something of that nature. Up here they have number 3, the server recognizes authorized credentials. So that implies that some sort of credentialing is occurring from, let's say, the Active Directory server, Microsoft Active Directory server in the middle, or some other similar type of authenticator in the middle, passes some sort of token to the server, and that server then recognizes the credentials and understands what the user is authorized to do. Or it could even deny access to unauthorized resources should it get that far. Here's you'll see this over and over, not only in this course, in other courses, but for certifications such as Security Plus or the CISSP certification. You'll see the CIA Triad or the triangle, and the CIA, it stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Those are the 3 primary information security aspects. There's actually several more, but those are the key ones that we'll be talking about, the CIA Triad. Okay. Logical access control. Who, the identification of the subject. What, the type of access being requested. When, now the timing of that access. Where, physical or logical location. Why, the purpose for which the access must be granted. And how, the type of access that we can granted to a subject. So I always like to think of, if you have a network center, let's say you have a bunch of database programmers that are working on a specific project, you might want to gain, if you're the system administrator, perhaps their working hours, you can say, well, you give them a time frame from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m. Maybe they come in, their standard office hours are 8 to 5, but you want to add that little bit of flexibility. And then you say, okay, when they're in their office area, let's say it's the second floor of a building, those computers have access to the Oracle database server. No other computers do, just those computers, and those login accounts also have access. So if somebody comes in at 2 a.m. and they arrive on the second floor, and they try to log into the database server, they won't be able to, based on the restrictions. They'll need prior approval, for example. So that also identifies this whole stream of who, what, when, where, why, and how. So keep that in mind when you're doing access control. Let's say you're setting up an Microsoft Access Directory group policies object, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in this course. Here are some objects, and these objects are pretty common objects. There's plenty more aside from them, but in a sense, there's a data element. You can think of that almost as either a file or a field. It could be as granular as a field. A table, which typically contains many entities. An entity contains many attributes, which are kind of like a field. I'd like to think of a table somewhat like a database spreadsheet, if you will. I know some people who are database gurus would hang me for that, but I've worked on enough databases to kind of use that analogy a bit. The entire database, the application itself, which could be a whole set of programs, the system and operating system. Now, system can refer to anything that encapsulates databases or people processes, the operating system itself, and the entire network. So we have several different objects here that are, let's say, part of authentication. We can allow people to access particular data elements or table or a database or an application or system or an operating system or network or some other combination of those. And there's more, again, as I mentioned, especially when we're talking about Microsoft group policy objects and Microsoft Active Directory, which we'll get to. Authentication elements. Now you see a lot of pieces and parts over to the right hand side. Something you know, something you are, and something you have. You can hear a train going by. Anyway, for example, when I give the ATM, I put my card into the ATM. That's something I have. That's a device, so it's a card. And then it's also something I know, the PIN number. So that's two-factor authentication. Something you are, you can have blended biometrics in there. So if that, for example, if you're logging in, a lot of you folks have phones that you can put your thumbprint on. That's something you are, if you will, your fingerprint, as well as the possession of a login, the phone itself. That's two-factor authentication. So two-factor authentication is a lot stronger than the single-factor authentication. And then there's multi-factor authentication, which even gets more complex. Off to the right, you have the PIN and password, for example, in that little green cloud. The thumbprint, that's something you are. The eye print, biometrics, the handprint, and then we have certain key fobs, which gives that little fob right there. It's an RSA token that actually generates a unique key that you need to register in. And then we see a smart card and a dongle, if you will, right there. So a couple of different devices that we'll be talking about in this course. Let's see, risk definitions and concepts. This is what we're going to walk through in the next couple of slides. What is risk? The asset value, the threat, the vulnerability, the probability of occurrence, the impact to the organization, and the control. Okay. Now those are all the aspects that we're going to deal with. Certainly one quick thing is on the asset value. If the asset value is somebody calculates it as $100 asset, you're not going to spend $50,000 to protect that $100 asset, for example. So even on a physical nature, I'm not going to protect my $40 mouse and put it in a $300 lockbox. So that would be on the physical nature, but we're going to talk more about the information systems aspects. So the first thing is the risk assessment. The risk assessment, we first need to determine which risks exist in an environment or which may occur in the future. So we're looking at risk from present day and what may go on in the future. We measure a level of risk by calculating the probability of occurrence and the potential impact on the environment. So if the probability is pretty high that some data may be stolen, for example, and the potential impact is really high, that's something that you'll want to protect. For example, if you have a database of account numbers and people's credit card information, as well as their credit score, that sort of thing, almost like Experian, for example. That's a high level of risk, and it's also probably a pretty high potential that the environment will be breached by attackers, which it was in this case. And on the opposite end, we talked about this. If the probability of it not being accessed, it's a low risk to the environment, and the impact's low, it may be a resource that you may not need to protect. Access control threats, password cracking. That's guessing or deciphering passwords. Now, there's a lot of different things that we can get into regarding password cracking. You can use things like rainbow tables. You can do brute force attacks. And there's several other items that we'll touch on as well. Second one is heightened access, the ability of the attacker to log onto a system under one level of access and exploit a vulnerability to gain a higher level of access. So that's a lot of the phishing attacks. When somebody clicks on a link, will launch malware, and the intended target is not just that one particular person's machine. It's for the attacker to get into the information system and then escalate their own privileges as, let's say, a regular user to eventually to a super user status, so they can go ahead and bounce around the databases and other portions of the network to gain access to other information systems within the organization. So that's raising of the access. Social engineering, use or manipulation manipulation, or trickery to convince authorized users to performing actions or divulge sensitive information to the attacker. I have, and I'm sure everyone has in this course, received phone calls asking me for personal information, or emails that are crafted very nicely and say, okay, please, we're going to be deleting your account soon if you don't give us your current password. Something as crazy as that. That would be a sense of a social engineering, trying to coax me to divulge information either about myself personally or about the organization. So we've got those three access control threats: password cracking, heightened access, and social engineering. And in my book, I think social engineering and then heightened access and password cracking, that would be the order, kind of in reverse of this slide. Let's see, access control vulnerabilities, insecure passwords. There's still, believe it or not, in 2018, the number one password that was cracked was password 1. Another one was 12345. I don't know if it was 12345 or 1234556, but you can go out to the internet and see a list of 40 or 50 common passwords, which people are still using, which surprises the heck out of me. Insecure storage, something that perhaps doesn't have an encryption key, or is just data is just being dumped out to let's say a Dropbox account, so that data that may be important, that yet the Dropbox is insecure. Insecure password hashes. A hash is a one-way function. For example, just as an example, if I did password ABC, that password ABC gets hashed to a one-way function, and that hash should be stored on the server. Well, if it's that hash is not stored in a secure location, there's a possibility that someone could backward engineer that hash to the password, depending on the hash size, the hash veracity, if you will, and if that set of hash files is encrypted too. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. Insecure applications run at too high of a privilege levels. In other words, you have, I want to say, just poorly coded programs, or maybe some legacy programs that are running at a higher privilege level. And the higher the privilege level is, that user or the program has more access to the entire information system. And then, of course, people are always the weakest link in any security environment. We just are. Risk assessment, there's both qualitative and quantitative. Quantitative statistics versus qualitative statistics. Quantitative is always numbers, qualitative is like opinions. So quantitative risk assessment involves numeric data, calculations that identify the risk, and also to rank the risks as well. So quantitative, for example, I know how much a computer costs. I can calculate what is the risk of that computer being stolen, and also what is the cost of that computer if it was stolen. So that would be more quantitative. Qualitative relies on expert opinion rather than the mathematical equations. So qualitative is more of expert opinions, and we each will have our own expert opinions about data resources as we go through. We can have quantitative assessment that supports our qualitative expert opinion, or that kind of refutes it, and that's something that we'd have to work through. Risk assessment strategies, of course, these are the 4 key ones. Avoidance. We want to. You can avoid a particular risk, and there's a lot of different ways to mitigate that. We'll talk about that. We can accept a risk. We can say, okay, that $30 mouse that I'm going to put in a $300 secure box, that's not going to happen. I'm just going to accept that. Maybe once in a while somebody will steal my mouse, and I'll just go ahead and replace it. So that's acceptance. Mitigation, some sort of we're going to corrective action that we'll take. That's a primary area. And then transference. Transference generally speaks to letting somebody else take the financial responsibility, and usually that's in terms of insurance. It's like cybersecurity insurance. You may have cybersecurity insurance. That somewhat transfers your risk. And again, anytime you're dealing with insurance, it's always, you can say transference with a little asterisk. You're still ultimately responsible, whether you're a consumer or you're an organization, for that data, even though you may have the cost for that somewhat handled by or transferred to the insurance company. Let's see, considerations for designing a risk assessment. We create a risk assessment policy. So basically you want to know what your overarching goal is for the organization in terms of what the assessment policy is. You define the goals and objectives, what the company needs, what to get out of a risk assessment policy, and then a description of a consistent approach or model. Actually, at my company, we're working through this right now, so it's a lot of legalese, and a lot of documentation, and agreement between everybody in the company as to what that is. Then once that's agreed upon, that policy, everyone signs off on it and agrees to go down that same path. Okay, so the next bullet down, the fourth one, inventory all IT infrastructure and assets. When I go and do risk assessment for organizations, which I do a lot, it's surprising how many companies do not know what software they have on their systems. So it's surprising to know that a lot of companies don't know what hardware. They have a notion that they have Windows machines. They don't really know how many Windows machines. They have a notion that they're using Office 365, but they don't know what other software is used on company computers as well. So that inventory all needs to be part of a risk IT infrastructure, an assessment of assets, if you will. And then there's a determination of the total value for all assets. So you need to know, okay, I've got 100 Dell 8100 computers or whatever they are, and they're valued at $1,000 each. So that's $810,000 or whatever the math equates to. And then I have all this software. So my total value for the organization is, let's say for all the assets I have $500,000 worth of assets, whether it's software, hardware, but I know what they are. And that way I can do the update policy and also restrict access or other programs from coming on board or even other hardware from being installed. There you go. And the next one, considerations for designing a risk assessment. Determine a yardstick or consistent measurement to determine the criticality of an asset. So this gets in line with whether it's hardware or software or any other type of asset. Certainly there's some assets that just aren't as critical. For example, if you have an electronic label maker that's an IP label maker, that may not be a key asset. Your key asset might be your database server, for example. So you need to know which ones are critical, because when, let's say if you're facing a data center that has been devastated by a natural disaster or by an intense cyber breach, you want to know what are the key assets that you need to recover right away, what you need to purchase perhaps, or even have as a backup area, if you will. So you categorize each asset's place within the infrastructure as critical, major, or minor. And actually I've seen this listed as, they're showing in this book 3 critical, major, and minor, but I've seen it listed at DoD as Department of Defense as 5 different levels. So you may see different levels depending on the type of organization you're working at. What are access controls needed? Where are access controls needed the most? And when I was looking at this in the book, one thing I noticed right away is they're missing routers in this particular slide. So kind of figure that as part and parcel. It's mentioned later on in other slides. The workstation, the switches, the firewalls, the servers, the printers, the remote clients. What I would say is you want to look at where the key assets are. For example, your most critical probably in this scenario would be the server, because that will host not only Active Directory perhaps, but also maybe a database or 2 or 3. So that'll be a key essential asset. Your workstation as well. And then getting down the tier, the firewall is probably pretty darn important, as well as the routers and switches. Remote clients, they fall a little bit less into needed most, because you can always let those remote clients drop off. In other words, if I'm doing a security plan, I'm going to start building it up from the server forward, because the server will be my most critical asset. Here's 7 domains of a typical IT infrastructure. And this is just some general domains. You can specify this even more. The user domain, see in the green box. The workstation domain, so you'll have multiple workstations. The LAN domain, local area network domain. The LAN to WAN interface domain, so how the LAN connects to the outside. And then over on the right hand side in the bottom, they're using some sort of wide area network to get to their server pool. So this could be a 2 or 3 location organization, and they say, well, all of our servers are in location 1, and location 2 and 3 have the users, maybe perhaps a different office building. And then down at the bottom is a remote access domain. And there's also a lot of issues with security on the remote access domain. But keep in mind these 7 different domains of a typical IT infrastructures. There's some variations as you go through in the real world, but this gives you a good handle. And by the way, you'll want to think of like security Active Directory as having these 7 key domains, so you can secure each one of these a little bit differently. Let's see, firewall controls the network traffic, ingress and egress. Here's where you get into the notion of whitelisting or blacklisting items that can come into the network or go out of the network. A blacklist are things that you don't want, a whitelist are things that you do want. Okay? External systems, well, it comes in to the corporate network. So you want to make sure those external systems are validated and authorized to come in. The internal systems, you have the firewall. You can actually set up the firewall to segment your network. This is really key. You want to segment your network based on 2 aspects primarily. That would be you want to have subdomains within the network. We mentioned this a little bit later on in the course. And you also want to, that subdomains are like the IP addressing scheme. That's at layer 3. And then you also want to use VLAN, which is virtual local area networks. That's at layer 2. But basically, what that's getting a little more into the weeds than this slide suggests. Basically rolling back to the firewall, we want to have the firewall have definitions that allow traffic in and even allow only certain traffic out as well, because we want to make sure that our firewall knows that you can't be sending 3 gigabytes of data every second on a particular interface, because then that would be kind of a red flag, if you will. Somebody might be exfiltrating a lot of data. So anyway, virtual labs. So this week we have in the virtual labs these items, which are kind of fun. I walked through them and went through them, and getting the first lab up and running is always the key, because then you can see how things are working after that. The second lab runs pretty quickly. So configure an Active Directory domain. You'll see what that is in a domain controller. Again, we talked about users and access. That's where it's going to start. Rubber's going to hit the road. You're going to start understanding this a little bit better. Managing Windows accounts and organizational units. Again, we talked about different units like payroll and that sort of thing. Those could be organizational units. And so you want to have certain restrictions on organizational units. So complete labs 1 and 2, and also the quizzes 1 and 2. And just keep in mind the due dates it's due Sunday by 11:59 Eastern. So try to target at least an hour or even two before that as your stopping time in case you run into any problems. Always best to even give yourself maybe 24 hours before. Push it as much as you can, but if you hit that 11:59, things get locked down. Okay, so there you go. That's our discussion for week one of the course, and I hope you enjoy it. And drop me any questions. I'm here to help. Bye bye.